right, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Raw Knowledge Podcast with your host, as ever, myself, Alex Connor. And today I'm joined by another Alex Thomas. Thank you for joining me this morning.
Thanks for having me, brother.
My pleasure, mate. You know what? Actually, I was chatting to a friend the other day. I don't meet many Alexes these days. I don't know if it's becoming a bit of a thing of the past.
Yeah, it's funny in the industry. I would say that, like the name Alex is a little bit more uncommon. In social sport, though, social sport settings, like if I was playing touch football, basketball, a little bit of boxing, I'll always meet an Alex, but typically not as common in the fitness industry.
This is true. Not a bad thing. Not a bad thing. Good to be unique, that's for sure. Now, Alex, for the people who may not be aware, give us a bit of a rundown. I like to start at the beginning. Tell us what you do and, more importantly, why you do it.
So I run the Sports Nutrition Association, which I guess most people might be familiar with Sports Nutrition Australia if they're listening to this podcast. So that's a regional affiliate body of the association, which is the global body now. So we're in New Zealand, Australia, like I said, Asia, the USA, and we're just setting up in Europe and then Canada at the end of the year. So what we do is establish and standardize what best practice is in the sports nutrition profession. I think that's the most apt way of sort of putting it. And what that means specifically is prior to our inception in the regions that we're in, it was sort of like the Wild West. Anyone could say, hey, I'm a sports nutritionist. And that could range from someone that's done like a sports science degree, majoring in sports nutrition, then doing some postgraduate work, which is like phenomenal. Yep, you're a sports nutritionist if you've done that. But to then someone that's done like a weekend workshop on hormones and how to optimize hormones, calling themselves a sports nutritionist because that's just an area that they decided to niche down on the basis of a recommendation that a business coach gave them or something like that. Or someone that's just done a lot of habitual online message board type research in the bodybuilding.com forums or something like that. And then, again, they're a self-appointed sports nutritionist. So what we wanted to do is do away with that, the Wild West side of things, and establish a really good standard of what it meant to be a sports nutritionist.
Yeah.
And so we do that by educating. We've got sort of like a private education arm and then a professional body and regulation arm as well.
I want to dive into that a little bit deeper and sort of segregate some definitions for the listeners. But before we do, was what got you into this realm of nutrition, if you will, like going right back? Was there any events? Were there any people that inspired you? Even because obviously you're a clinical nutritionist yourself, what was that sort of first initial conception for you to move into that space? Obviously before the Nutrition Association, etc. Is it something you just fell into, or was this something that you were always passionate about?
I mean, the story, like if people retrace my steps, it's funny, like I sit down with accountants or like lawyers and they'll be like, oh, this is like so well designed. And you think that it was well planned, but I completely fell into it. And it all started from a place of, I like just trying to protect myself. So I had a training center with an allied health clinic in it. And I was like, right, we're going to have these like phenomenal centers that'll be a one-stop shop for everyone. And my insurance broker at the time was a member of ours. And so he was in there for an appointment and we were talking about like renewals and stuff. And I had strength coaches, personal trainers on the team. There was probably like 3 to 4 of those. But then I also had like degree qualified people who were sports scientists, exercise physiologists, as well as dietitian on team, physiotherapist, all that stuff, right? And so the majority of our coaches were degree qualified people, but they were in that some form of iteration of like sports science, ex-phys. And basically they, as it turned out, even though they'd done a few electives and we were talking about food and we had a dietitian on staff, my broker turned around and was like, hey, you're not qualified, or you're not covered rather for anything that any of these people in the coaching team are saying. The only one that you're covered for is the dietitian. And I was like, what the fuck do you mean? Like, this sucks. And he was like, yeah, you're liable, like even though it's a public liability, proprietary limited company, you like, even though it's like supposed to be limited liability, you're actually covered. And it's like your neck on the chopping block. And I was like, wow, this sucks. I remember sort of just mulling over those words for about the better part of like 2 weeks nonstop and just thinking, okay, crap. Like, what's the liability period? Wow, it's 7 years. So everything that my staff do from now until, for the next 7 years, it's my neck on the line. So I came back to him like two weeks later after like ruminating on it nonstop, being like, what do? We have to do something about this, right? Like, this is ridiculous. And he was like, you know what? I don't think anyone's like, it is ridiculous, but I don't think anything has been done. I'll talk to some underwriters and we'll get the ball rolling. And so we spent the next sort of 6 to 12 months working on a framework to establish like something that would have an actual legitimate insurance policy for the provision of sports nutrition in a product disclosure statement for an insurance product. And while all this was happening, this sort of coincides, right? So it's like the perfect storm where I was just floundering in university at the time, racking up a HECSTET, but not really accomplishing anything. Back in the day, what I was studying, this is like, I sound so old, but God, I feel old. I'm only 32, but what you studied back in the day, or back in my day, was called Bachelor's in Human Movement, right? So that was like what today is exercise physiology. So you did a human movement program, and there was the dual of human movements and nutrition dietetics that was available. And so that was a path that I was like, right, I had my heart set on that. But as I was going through undergrad, I was like, wow, these subjects aren't really related to what I want to be studying. And so I had this romantic notion and ideology and idea that if I was studying that, I was going to be really learning how to optimize human movement, optimize human performance, optimize metabolism and body composition through both exercise and nutrition. And what I was exposed to, what wasn't really that, like what those programs, especially what I was doing. And I've had friends and colleagues go through similar experiences. And then I've had friends and colleagues more recently go through experiences that are very, I guess, like very much the opposite of this. And they're very, like, they're a lot more specific to the athletes and optimization. But if we're talking 15 years ago now, these programs were really centered around giving you a base level understanding of the basic sciences, and then really looking at like improving public health at a population level. So a lot of the subjects were geared around that. And I was like, wow, I'm racking up this HECSTET to become a glorified personal trainer. I was already a personal trainer at the time. And I was like, well, forget that. So I'd sort of like defer and then go back and then muck around, not really sort of getting anywhere. And then when I decided to set my own facility up, I'd made the decision that I wasn't going to be completing any forms of those undergraduate programs at that point. But probably 2 years before setting up the facility was when I first encountered the Journal of the International Society of Sports Nutrition. So I was pretty disenfranchised with my studies and what I was getting out of them in the formal education sense. I guess for lack of a better word, I was disenfranchised by it. So I was like, all right, well, I got to find somewhere, a resource must exist where I can get the information that I want to. And so that's what the JISSN was. And so the ISSN had these exams in place where it was like, right, if you're in an undergraduate program, you can sit this exam and we'll recognize your capability as a sports nutritionist. It's just a pass-fail multiple choice online exam. And if you're doing a postgraduate program, say you've completed your undergraduate, then there's the postgrad exam as well. So did the undergrad exam, smashed that, and then started looking at the journal frequently. They'd had a textbook they published, which was the Essentials. And it was a really good textbook for its time. And we're talking like now over 10 years ago, over a decade ago. And sports nutrition and sports nutrition education has advanced a lot since then. But that was like really the first forum where it all came in, right? So the ISSN is just over 18 years old now, formally, since its like inception, where they've been doing really regular work. But prior to that, there was no sort of one-stop shop for it. So I was about 2 years into being a member and my exposure to the ISSN, and I was talking and liaising with the presidents and founders and board members of that at the time. And I'd sat the exam and I was like, right, we need to include, we've got this exam. Will the insurers sort of acknowledge that was the first thing. And so the first iteration of what we were doing was just, hey, here's how to practice. Here's how to pass this multiple choice exam. And so then the underwriters accepted it, but they came back with the question of, well, how do we know where? Because we've got this established profession that is dietetics, right? So it's like, how do we know where the line starts and ends for sports nutrition, and then where dietetics takes over?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where, fortunately for me, some of my colleagues and peers who had been studying and then kept studying the whole way through, they were doing masters and PhDs in dietetics at the time. And so we caught up, and I was like, look, we need to have this triage system where it's like a green, amber, and red. Really just like very similar to the FMS system, functional movement screening system, but we do it for nutrition, and we only look at contraindicated definite health risks, right? And so I was like, I'm sure it's there. We'll be able to trawl the literature, find what we need. And so this is how we draw the line in the sand for where sports nutrition starts and ends. And then when we start looking at clinical dietetics and nutrition intervention of chronic disease and health treatments and stuff. So effectively, that's what we worked on for about 6 months, submitted that through, and that was the first accepted sort of like curriculum or cornerstone of the initial curriculum to get myself and my staff covered. And so when I then put us through that, I had a couple of friends do it, colleagues who had facilities and stuff as well. They were like, hey, I need to do this too. And I had no, like, after doing it, the first one, everyone passed. It was great. And it was me just standing in front of a whiteboard being like, here's the subject matter. This is what you need to learn. This is what you do with clients. This is all this kind of stuff. This is what the evidence says, just breaking down what was in the journal, prepping them for the exams, giving them case study scenarios based on, what the literature had said at the time, and then going from there. And, like that was it. It was like this 8-week program, just sort of these hectic whiteboard sessions for half a day for 8 weeks. And everyone got through, and I had no intention of doing more. It was like, right, we've done it. And then as soon as we were about halfway through, we already had 5 to 10 people calling me up being like, how do I do this next one? And this was sort of before we were really sharing a lot of stuff on social media at the time as well. Like if something was being shared on social media, it was like, all right, I'm going to tag myself on Facebook with Alex, like with myself. So my friends would tag me. They'd be like, hey, getting some learning on or something like this, and tag it on Facebook. But it wasn't a story, a video showing what was being learned. There was no branding or anything like that. So people just being like, they would hit them up and say, what are you studying and whatnot? And so that's where they would answer them and say, oh, this, and there's this thing. And so by the time we finished it, we were sort of at like 3/4 capacity for the next intake that we hadn't even set a date for. And so we ran the next one sort of like 3 to 4 months later. And then it was just this sort of 4 monthly to 5 monthly thing where people were just hitting us up and word of mouth was just following. And so I'll be like, we set up, and the first one was in Australia. I don't know if you can tell from my accent or not, but I'm Australian. Alex wasn't sure if I was Australian or not, but the first one was in Australia. So that was, wow, I think like we started the process about 8.5 years ago now. So that was we're just on either 8 years ago now or 7.5, just over 7.5 years ago now. So that was in Australia. That was our first pilot program. We did that for about 2 years before the insurers came back, and they were like, you've put about, I think it was at the time, it was sort of like 60 to 90 people through this over the last 2 years. They're all still practicing. You really need to start looking before we keep writing more policies, which is great for business, right? More people going through, more policies, more money for them. But they were like, you really need to start looking at like regulating this. And at this point, I was like, all right, like what's involved in that? I had no clue. And that's sort of when we started the process to set up, incorporate sport, what then became Sports Nutrition Australia, have a non-profit professional body that regulates the professionals, charge a membership fee, for the professional registration and audits, all that stuff that follows. And then that got set up. And then from there, I had my colleague who I'd worked with in the past for a number of years, Matt White, who was in New Zealand at the time. And he was like, man, this would be really sick. I want to study it, but we should look at setting this up in New Zealand. I know that there's a big market for that there as well. So then we set up in New Zealand. New Zealand was about 4 years ago now, 4.5 years ago. And then from there, it was Asia. We were getting people enrolling from Asia. And then we had a conference in early 2019 and had international speakers. And that's where colleagues of mine from the US, UK flew in, and I presented about just some industry claim stats just since we'd started. So since we'd sort of registered Sports Nutrition Australia, the claims in the industry within fitness and nutrition in a direct, almost a direct proportion of one another had increased per month and per year by 1,000% in the 3 years that we'd been established within Australia within that time. And that was just as a result of like the growing trend of no win, no fee stuff. And so we don't hear about a lot of this stuff because a lot of these claims don't make their way to court, and they don't have a lot of press around them when they do, because they end up settling either pre or in the early stages of it as like, you know, a quick settlement with a non-disclosure agreement, right? And so parties may or may not accept responsibility, or even acknowledge that they're accepting responsibility, but whether or not they do or not, it's not to be disclosed after it settles. And so we're not really made aware of this stuff. But yeah, basically the claims had increased by about 1,000%. It was like, look, here's the numbers. We know better. We can be doing better. We should be doing better. The goal is we want to be doing better at this point. And we really want to, you know, for a market at the time that was about 70,000 registered exercise and sports science professionals, it's like we want everyone to be aware of what their scope of practice is as it relates to nutrition. Let's do a better job, make sure that everyone's aware, make sure that everyone then, once they're aware, they're making better informed decisions professionally. We're looking after the general public, but then at the same time, we're ensuring that every professional is then looking after themselves in that 7-year liability period. And so I presented that for, I don't know, it was like all of 10 minutes, just in the middle of everyone else's presentations and speeches. And that's when, we were having dinner later that night with my colleagues, and they were like, wow, we want to get this in America, as well as the UK and Europe as well. And so at that point, it was like, cool, let's do it. Started setting everything up. This year was actually going to be the year that we're going to do that stuff and start launching those things. And then COVID hit. And we were like, wow, let's make it earlier. Like, we may as well. We're not going to be, normally I would travel. We'd have initiatives within Australia where we have like stuff around like physique contest preps, where we get in and say, hey, look, this is what the best practice of a prep looks like, and start making people aware so that we can start avoiding some of these horror stories. We're going to start doing, so we did that in 2019. We're going to do that again in 2020. We're going to then look at doing like a weight cutting thing for athletes as well, and just some initiatives to then make the public aware, but then make coaches aware. And that would mean that I'd be traveling the country sort of like 4 or 5 times a year, get overseas a bit. All that travel got stopped. So, and we couldn't run those events. So it meant that we could bring the timeline forward for the other countries, right? And other regions. So then we started doing that. So in October of last year, we launched in the US, and that's been going really strong. And then I think it was in November, we nominated and announced the Global Association. And I guess that's everything that's gotten me up until this point. So it sounds like fantastic and this like well orchestrated thing, but it was literally just being in these positions at that time, having the experiences that I had, identifying that there was this big gap, being like, wow, no one's doing anything about it. Well, if no one's doing anything about it, well, I'm going to do something about it at least. So I guess the only thing that we would say is, you know, people always say like, oh, luck's where like preparation meets opportunity. I guess like I'd done the preparation, and I've always had this attitude where it's like, well, I will always bank on myself to be able to see something through. So if you put me in a room of people and it makes sense, I know that I'll be able to get it done. If I know that, all right, no one's doing this, I'll know I'll be able to do these things. You know, if we've got to crack a few eggs and break a few eggs to make an omelet, we're going to make the omelet.
Yeah.
And sort of,
it's a good sort of synopsis in terms of you've got a lot of business ideas, a lot of concepts come from where there is a problem or there is a bridge, you know, a gap that needs to be bridged in many respects. And it is a massive gray area. It's exciting how rapidly it's developing, but then also as well, it's like you're going through with a fine tooth comb. You know, you mentioned a few different sort of curriculums there where it's like, okay, we need a benchmark for weight cutting. We need a benchmark for physique prep. We need a benchmark for who's doing what and where and what's covered. And initially sort of who bridges that gap and how do we define it? So it's like going through and kind of setting that up, which is really important. And you touched on it a few times there, Alex, and I want to sort of go back a little bit because a lot of people are confused that a lot of the common questions I get is, what's the difference between a dietitian and a sports nutritionist and this, and how many different types are there? It's the whole, what does the osteo versus the chiro versus the physio do? And sometimes there's an amalgamation of things and it gets confusing. So could you perhaps succinctly sort of silo what the categories are, what the differences are between like a dietitian, a sports nutritionist, a clinical nutritionist, if there's any others, for example, and then maybe even where you're going with that, because there might be other silos. I know I spoke to Eric Helms on the podcast, and this was a while ago now, and I was asking him, I'm like, look, where do I go? Where do I go now from here with nutrition without necessarily having to do a master's? Because he's like, well, you're going to learn all this, but you're kind of only going to get that, and you're only going to use this. And I think this was at a period where you guys were still kind of up and coming, and obviously now it's worked out well, because I sort of found out about Phil for other people, and obviously he's one of the assessors for you guys, and it was like, okay, this is now a more direct way forward for people like me. But does that make sense?
Yeah. So I mean, I'll if you wanna say, like, I guess the title of the profession, I can give you like their bandwidth and scope that they operate within, and help people distinguish, I guess, the differences. So if you've got like an APD, which is accredited practicing dietitian, they are someone that can work with medical interventions, like a medical intervention through nutrition, right? They can treat and manage certain chronic diseases and certain ailments through nutrition. And they can work in conjunction with doctors for managing nutrition with certain medications as well. A clinical nutritionist is someone that can do something very, very similar, but then the scope is then reduced. So they're not going to be able to treat and manage certain chronic disease and conditions. And they really, like I guess what we're told is that as soon as there's like medications involved, then that's where they really need to be then referring on to the dietitian.
That makes sense.
So then a sports nutritionist is someone that primarily works in the realm of sports performance through to body composition management and then weight management. And so I would say, look, this is my own bias, but 95% of people are going and talking to someone about their food because they want to manage their weight. And so if you're going to and it's not to say that a dietitian or a clinical nutritionist isn't going to be capable of doing that. It's just that when we look at the academic curriculum and the subject curriculum that they're exposed to, there is so much clinical, medical nutrition. Like now in most dietetics programs, there's 2 oncology subjects, just like how to manage nutrition with cancer, right? So these people are phenomenal at that, but they're not getting amazing training in like adaptive metabolism, energy availability, weight management approaches. It's not to say that they're not capable or anything like that. It's just to say that the curriculum that they're exposed to isn't the curriculum to best help them succeed professionally in those endeavors. And so if someone was to say, hey, look, I am pre-diabetic and I've got hypertension and I need to lose weight, then a dietitian is going to be good for them, right? Is that dietitian going to help them lose the weight the best way possible to avoid rebound and all that kind of stuff? Look, potentially not. But is the dietitian going to help them lose weight with hypertension, pre-diabetes? Yeah, that's going to be the best person for them. However, if it's someone who doesn't have those things and they just want to lose weight and manage their weight, then that's where a sports nutritionist or a sports dietitian, someone that's done their dietetics, who's then done 2 years postgraduate study specifically on sports beyond that as well, a sports dietitian, that's where they're going to be the best suited for that. If we're looking at performance, improving athletic performances, if we're looking at things like a physique competition, if we're looking at like weight cuts, again, that's the sports nutritionist, sports dietitian realm.
It always seems to me like there's the segregation. If you were to sort of split it up, you've got the clinical setting here, getting people who are unwell and have ailments to at least well or healthy, quote unquote. And then we've got now I want to be above, normal. It might even be just getting someone, to a more athletic, if you like, physique standpoint, or even, sort of a more performance based. And then obviously, wow, we're looking at elite athletes. And I think this is the conversation I always have. And you've sort of nailed it there, where it's confused, or it has been confusing to me and a lot of people. You're like, well, hang on, how can someone who's done so much study, but then that it almost seems like the simple like body composition stuff is not there. Some of the dietitians struggle, and having conversations with friends who are dietitians who have given me really like examples when they're working in hospitals and things like that. They're like, Alex, you'd be surprised at how simple this is, but it's just like keeping someone alive. Like, and sometimes that can be, very wearing over time. But then, sort of going on the opposite side of that, going, well, that's great, and we need these people, and that's probably a whole nother rabbit hole about things could probably be improved in hospitals, because you think, hang on, these are people who are in need of quality nutrition, and yet the qualitative aspect of it sometimes is, from what I've heard, again, I'm not their first person, is not quite there. But again, that's probably another gap that needs to be filled. But then obviously going into the performance realm, where people are more, it seems a little bit more glamorous, doesn't it? It's a bit more like, ooh, it's cool, kind of getting every single percent out of the athlete and looking at things very strategically. Yes, I think that's probably where most people think of nutrition to a degree.
Yeah. And it's funny. Like, I would say, people, I guess, look at it as though they're two camps. Where it's like, hey, you can't have performance or body composition with health at the same time. And I would say they're intrinsically linked until you get to like the elite acute extremes. And that might be like 2 weeks out from an event, or the event itself. It's not really healthy. If you're pursuing world championship level, right? But if you're a 16-year-old kid and you're looking to peak for or set yourself up to have a really good career when you're 24, 25, then what you're doing at 16 shouldn't be compromising health. And so I think that's where people sort of often throw the baby out with the bathwater, and they're like, oh, well, health is different to sports performance or weight management, body composition. It's like both need to be sports needs to be considerate of health almost at all times. And it needs to be considerate of health to the point where it's like, even if you are doing extreme things in a world championship setting, you need to be aware of what the risk versus reward is. So you need to be mindful enough to be aware of that. It's just to say that when we're talking about separating the two, it's just that clinically trained health optimizers through nutrition, just by virtue of the curriculum that they're exposed to as a default, if we're just saying, hey, this is a default, not including anything that they go and do at a postgraduate or an additional study, but just the minimum standard, so that dietitian in a hospital is not going to be the best person to prepare an athlete for an event, or they're not going to be the best person to help someone lose 40 to 50 kilos long term. Factor in the energetic variables within their lifestyle, and do so in the most optimal way without avoiding weight rebound, and introducing them to concepts such as diet breaks, for managing their adherence, managing their hunger and perception of effort whilst going through a dieting period. Things like that, they're not going to be exposed to. They're just going to be like, right, whack you in a massive deficit. This is what you need to stick to. And then as things improve, you'll be good.
Yeah. And there's no, like you said, sort of attention there to energy availability, body fat percentage, and then maybe things like relative energy deficiency in sport. If obviously depending on the performance of the athlete and what they're doing. Yeah, that's fascinating, because you think, well, if you're doing dietetics and you're doing all this, you think, well, maybe we'd cover that. It seems to me like it would be more of a basic, hey guys, let's kind of cover that. Okay, maybe we don't need to look at peaking for physique. Maybe we don't need to look at that. But I don't know, when I did, fortunately for me, early on, I was always sort of seeking knowledge. And I found the likes of Eric Helms and the crew I studied in New Zealand. And I read all the pyramids and whatnot. And then that led me on to other people like Lane Norton, this, and I'd always sort of dissimulate it. And I think that really helped build that. It was just all of the amalgamation of knowledge over time. But that was always my question when I was speaking to practitioners and professionals like yourself. I was like, what where am I going to go with this? Because I don't necessarily want to work in a hospital. I want to sort of work with people from more of a performance standpoint, if you will, or a sporting perspective. But kind of where is that segregation of knowledge? And yeah, like you said, this is why I guess we need these governing bodies like yourselves, or these institutions where we can actually go, hey, here's the line in the sand. Here's kind of what we need to know for each silo to a degree, and kind of improve that industry standard, especially because, as you said, we get a lot of horror stories where, especially in the sporting realm, where you think people that could sort of without doing a fucking, because this is the thing. I mean, I started off in sports science. It was, I'm going to do masters, I'm going to do this. And it actually took a master's student to say, hey, look, don't actually, unless you really want to, like, just start with a, degree, like figure out what you want to do. And he says, trust me, he's like, specialize. And this was years ago. And this was just an advice because this particular individual was like, look, I've done all this year of studies. Like, I've got these qualifications, but it's not specific. It's like, it's really hard to find jobs. He's like, if I could offer any advice, I mean, I was only young at the time. I was 17 when I started studying, just straight out of college, straight in. And he's like, look, just try and find something you're passionate about and find a niche. And this was many years ago now, but probably good advice in hindsight. But again, it took years for things like this to develop. And I'm glad I sort of waited rather than going into a course where I would have sort of maybe only been using, 10 or 20% of that knowledge. And a lot of it would have been wasted. And that is kind of how it works anyway. The 80-20 rule does seem to persist, where you will find yourself using a percentage of that knowledge rather than everything you've learned in many respects. I wanted to ask, actually, I know we've only got 15 left, but in terms of the highest qualification in the performance realm, because I want to go on and do the IOPN, I think that's one of the most recognized, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, so we've got we've got 4 programs we're referring to. So we've got the IOPN, the IOC, HPN2, and then AUT have a 180 grad dip to master's bridging pathway as well. Right. So depending on where you want to go with it, if you know that you want to go to master, I would just say go straight to AUT. Eric's a research fellow there. You get access to him. And they're doing it remotely now. So that's something that we started working on sort of like 2 years ago, was like a link in to their grad dip to master's bridging pathway there. But other than that, the other 3, HPN2, IOPN, IOC, they're all phenomenal equivalents of a postgraduate diploma. That graduates of the cert, I think people think, I just got to clarify this as well, that graduates of the cert get guaranteed entry into. And I think people think, they're like, well, I've got to, what's this? After 3 years, I've got to do more study. And it's like, because otherwise, like, we don't want you settling for the minimum, but also it's like, there's a huge privilege getting guaranteed entry into these programs, because otherwise you would have to do an undergraduate, like you'd have to complete a bachelor's. That's the whole thing. Like, we've been able to establish these relationships where you can go in and there's an entry pathway because the curriculum is good, and because you get those years of experience, we've been able to establish these like direct entry pathways for you to get access to things that you would otherwise cost a lot more money and take a lot more time to get to.
Yeah, it's like a more direct route, which is exactly especially if you're passionate in this area, it avoids a lot of wasting of resources and time. I actually spoke to a few people on my course about this, and they were like, "What? I have to like upskill in 3 years?" And I'm like, "Yeah, otherwise you won't get like recognized." And I'm like, "Why?" And I'm like, "Because they don't want you settling for mediocrity." But anyway, I guess this is why you've got to be passionate about it. But with that evolution of qualification in that realm, what would that qualify you to do more? Obviously, you have to understand the concepts at a higher level or in greater detail. But for example, if I put this into context, this is my interpretation. If someone was looking to employ me or contract me, say for, let's say, Man United, would they go, well, hang on a minute, Alex has got all this years of experience, but he's got this very high accredited level of performance nutrition. And obviously someone at the high end like them would go, well, we want him because he's got, more knowledge at that specific end of performance. Is that kind of the difference between someone who furthers their education in the performance realms? It just gives you more of a bespoke high-end qualification where you'd have more precision and maybe tools in the old tool belt.
Yeah, for sure. And like, for instance, we wouldn't want someone with the certificate working like in a clinical sports nutritionist setting in the first place. So it's like, it's that provisional qualification. So it's like, don't go get the cert and then go pay rent somewhere and say, hey, I'm a sports nutritionist. That's reserved for the openly accredited people. If you want to take up like a clinical office space or anything like that and then work exclusively in that line, you know, the cert is there as the provisional qualification for people who, let's say you're a fitness professional, right? It's for you to dip your toes over, transition the business model to be way better, like in my opinion, and like the numbers support it. We've got a video coming out on YouTube in the next few weeks that'll sort of like break it all down for you so that you can see it. We like when COVID hit, when COVID hit last year in our May and July intakes, we tripled our like intake openings to be able to help specifically for fitness professionals to transition over, because everyone's like, oh, be an online PT. It's like, how do you do that effectively without having sports nutrition services to offer? So, yeah, like from our end, it's like, look, set it up, get it good. And then if you like it and and you're generating a decent amount of revenue from it, 500 plus a week, then it's like, hey, at some point double down. And if you eventually want to transition, not have any of those coaching appointments in a week, then become openly accredited. And like you said, like if you want to be that person who is applying for a job at Man U, then yeah, you need to be openly accredited and registered. So we've got the sportsnutritionaustralia.com, and that's where prospective employers will like run a name check, Google you, make sure that you're openly accredited, and then they'll see the additional stuff attached to your name, whether it's master's, PhD, research, whatever it is. It doesn't have to be, but then they can reference that as well and then see that. And those will be things they're looking for. They at least want you to have a bachelor's or a postgrad dip as a minimum when you're applying for these jobs.
That makes sense. That's good. I look forward to that video actually in terms of the model, because that was something I was going to dive into a little bit, but we'll probably save that maybe even for the next one. Before we sort of get towards the end and some of the rapid fire, what I wanted to ask you is what are some of the, and again, we'll keep it short and sweet with this, but the biggest misconceptions that you see practitioners making within this space, and what are the ways to kind of alleviate that? For example, it could be misconceptions within terms of diet fads. It can be the way they approach clients. I'm not quite sure, but what do you see being the biggest mistakes and how to perhaps rectify those?
I just see, like, you know how you were talking about before when you said, like you wanted to get into the space, right? But you wanted to find a way that you could get access to it. And apart from us, the only traditional ways were complete your undergrad, and then sports was offered at a postgraduate level. So it was going to be those postgrad dips or a master's in sport and exercise nutrition at specific universities. I know University of Sunshine Coast with Gary Slater, they've got a really good master's program in sports nutrition, but typically they want you to be the dietitian or an exercise physiologist first and sort of then go down that road. So from my end with that, I would say that the biggest misconception is people, like you're saying, they'll have these ideas and like romantic notions where it's like, okay, I'm going to go study that because it means that I get to work with this amazing data, right? I get to work with the athletes in the 1%, like what you were talking about before. And it's like, yeah, you do. But the reality is that for 99% of you, you're self-employed. And so that's why we have the cert and the 3-year provisional period. So that way you can get in and start getting your feet wet at an experiential level very, very early and applying these concepts in a practical setting with clients to then start experience, like taking some L's, right? So taking some losses, taking some learns, taking some lessons on board, and then refining and developing your craft as a professional throughout that process. So we don't recommend to people who come into the program completely green, we don't recommend that they, go and study straight away. Now, if you're a fitness professional and you've got years of experience servicing clients, that's a different story. It's like you want to keep studying, go for it. But typically with the certificate and with what we do, we've got 4 different markets that who look at enrolling, right? So we've got a fitness professional looking to transition their business, add the service offering, and sort of test the waters in that space. We've got someone that's completed a relevant sports science or nutrition science degree. And so they just want to then register with us to then have the sports component. So from their end, it'll be like, right, I'm a clinical nutritionist, but I want to practice in the sports setting. Mm-hmm. And I can't do online check-ins for people because I'm not covered for it, because I have to have SOAP notes and patient notes for every appointment. Whereas for a registered sports nutrition service, I don't have to do that. Plus, a clinical nutritionist won't have the scope of practice to work in a sports setting. That won't be in their product disclosure statement. Same thing for a registered dietitian if they're not the sports dietitian. So they'll look to add that, or an ex-phys who's done a couple of nutrition electives. They want to have the sports setting, move away from the SOAP notes, that type of person. The third one will then be a student. So then someone who's studying one of those programs. And my biggest suggestion for them is, mate, do this in first or second year. So that way you're graduating with a client list straight away. Because when I was going through, when you were looking at doing this stuff, this didn't exist. No. But if I could do this whilst I was doing what other undergrads of today that are less public health based, then, I would have done it. I would have been registered. I would have, and then I would have worked my whole way through, come out with a client base of the clients that I want to be working with from day one. And then the fourth one is the green person, right? And so the green people, we will say, don't study straight away. You need to have that period to refine those things, because like we would see, success leaves clues and industries demonstrate trends, right? And like what we see in SNC, very, very few people are employed by the team as that team nutritionist, as that, team specialist. And then what they don't understand is you're at the mercy of the coach. Like every time a coach gets fired, then that whole coaching and like support team, a lot of the time they're gone as well. And so the life of these professionals isn't that great if you're employed by the team. Whereas if you can be that person that develops those skills in a private setting, in a private practice setting, you generate clients really, really well, then you can do quite well. Phil, who you mentioned before, he does really, really well privately. He's just had a guy who's an NFL player who's come on recently, and he's doing like awesome things, giving him a shout out on an NFL like media day. And now Phil's inundated with all these inquiries as it relates to this guy, because he's one of the best kickers in the league. So I would say depending on the audience or depending on like our type of student that we get of those four, there's misconceptions sort of at every level. I would say there's a misconception that, like you were talking about, like for say students, right? I'm going to go do dietetics because I want to learn about this. Well, you're not going to. And then the misconception is, well, you would think that you would, but the reality is like certain places like Endeavour College of Natural Health, they run dietetics degrees now. So you're not going to learn about energy availability through them. And a big thing that we have, and I guess it comes up with like competitors, because like no one really competes with us because we're the body first. So the private education is just a way that we can help people get compliant. So say it's someone who's done one of those courses and degrees, they may not have all the subjects. So we've then just got to fill the gaps for them. And so that's why the private education sort of exists, is to help whoever's at those different levels of, student background transition into the industry. But like the rate at which academic curriculum is disseminated is really, really slow as well. So like unis are now talking about EA in certain programs, but that was first published in 2014. And the average rate at which it gets disseminated into a curriculum is 4 to 6 years. And so for us, we can update it because we choose not to affiliate with any country's national framework, because one, the rate at which it disseminates is so slow. If we were to, we couldn't update annually and have it very, very contemporary and relevant based on the research. And then two, all the countries and regions never complement one another. There's always differences. So what we have now with the global body is, it's like once you recognize one region, you've met the criteria to be recognized in all. So then you just say, right, once COVID settles down, I'm leaving Australia, I'm going to go to America. Right, we just do a passport admin transfer, pay an admin fee, and then off you go. There's no headache associated with it. Whereas we get people who have done a PhD in dietetics in Italy, and they can't register to be a dietitian in Australia because our frameworks are different. Yeah. And so like the speed of that the information is disseminated and then passed on to people, so that way, you know, that way they can be taught relevantly, is quite slow in traditional academia. And then these frameworks don't complement one another. And so, you know, courses will be out there and be like, we're nationally accredited. And we're like, well, we're not. And here's why. And we don't want to make any warranties about why we're not, or even infer that we are, because to us, being nationally accredited is like a weak point. It's like, cool. So you're going to update your stuff every 4 to 5 years. And then what you've got something that's recognized in Australia, great for the Aussie people, but not great for if you've got A, international clients, which a lot of people do now. Mm-hmm. And then B, if you then have the prospect of wanting to work globally or anything like that. So for us, it was all about like relevance. And when you look at our board members of the association, look, we jump in, we review the curriculum annually. And then we, like in conjunction with reviewing the curriculum with the board, then we work in conjunction with the insurers and the underwriters based on current claims. And that's what informs our curriculum, right? And so we have the top professionals in the industry in the world reviewing it annually and then passing on feedback based on the research that they're interpreting. And then we've got it with the most current insurance claim statistics. And this is updated annually. It's like the minimum standard can't be better, in my opinion, based on that formula compared to like other models.
Yeah, no, I love that, mate, and I appreciate you going through all those little avenues. And there's probably a lot more to extrapolate, but perhaps a round two as well for people who.
Yeah, I think for sure. I think if anyone's got questions or they listen to this and they've got questions, mate, just get them to hit you up, and then we can sit down and knock out like a big Q&A or something like that for sure.
Perfect. Yeah, because there's a few other important topics I'd love to cover. So what I'll do is I'll collate all of that back, and like you said, we can do a bit of a Q&A and go through and sort of tick all the main sort of boxes off that people want. For before you do go, for people that want to obviously find out more, I will link in, you know, the association, etc. Is there anywhere else you would lead people onto if they want to find out about more about you or follow along, or any other resources you'd want to share, Alex?
Yeah. So I know you said like, hey, look, I practice clinically and stuff. I haven't practiced for about like 18 months now. So I might get back and practice. I get hit up probably like once a month at least for me to take on clients, but I don't. So if you're thinking, oh, I want to work with this guy, sorry, at the moment, my my commitments are to the association first and foremost. And then, but if they want to hit me up or follow any of the stuff that I'm doing, like with the program, with the body, as far as it relates to like scope or just being informed on in that capacity, then they can just hit me up. My Instagram handles at Aussie Sports Nutritionist, all one word. And that's probably the best place. I'm all right on Instagram. I'm not on it that much. I'm not like someone that's on social media heap. You can attest to this, Alex.
Yes, that's all good. But the funny thing is, or the ironic thing is, that most people who aren't super active on social media actually do really well in the real world. And there's, you know, not always, but for the most part, it's a bit of a disconnect.
I've definitely got to up my game. It's something that I know is a priority. It's just like, I'm like, oh, like my phone rings 24/7. I'm like, oh, get away from me. But it's a love-hate relationship, and I'm getting better at it. So yeah, just by all means, hit me up on that. If I can help in any capacity, just let us know. But yeah, like, mate, I had a ball. Even if the next time you want to pop up to our offices and we can just knock it out in the studio here.
Yeah. Are you guys in Brizzy? Whereabouts are you?
In Albion in Brisbane, yeah.
Yeah, perfect. I'm down there frequently, actually, with one of my business coaches. So we'll make it work. It'll be a great round two. I will add all those links for everyone. Everyone knows what to do. Like, comment, subscribe. Obviously, leave a rating and a review. Last thing from you, Alex, I appreciate your time. Thank you for joining me. If you could just leave the audience with one bit of information to improve their life on the daily, it can be something that we've talked about today or something completely different. What advice would you pass on for people to do?
Just enjoy the present moment. And try and find the space. This is going to sound really abstract, but just try and identify the space in between the seconds to see how much like time in the present moment there is. Because no matter how busy you are and stuff, if you can do that, you know, then if you can do that, then you'll still enjoy every moment with what you're doing. Yep.
I second that. Something I'm trying to practice lately, and I've been talking to a lot of my clients about: mindfulness, enjoying the moment, being present. Alex, it's been fantastic. Thank you for joining me.
No worries, man. Thanks for having me.
All right, guys, stay fearless. Chat soon.